Welcome to the second week of a message series for Lent we're calling Catholic Guilt. In this series, we're digging into this idea of Catholic guilt because Catholic guilt can get in the way of Catholic faith. So, first of all, what exactly is Catholic guilt? Well, I think it depends on who you ask. For many people, Catholic guilt stems from the perception that the Catholic faith is just one long list of rules, things you'd better not do or else. And because we're human and we inevitably fall short, we feel guilty. Or it can feel like you're never doing enough to be a good Catholic, whatever that's supposed to mean. And of course, no matter if you're Catholic or not, we all experience guilt, shame, regret, and remorse. It's part of life. So in this series, we're looking at that mixed up mess of sin and guilt and shame. Might sound uncomfortable, and certainly in some ways it is. But uncovering the truth about these ideas leads to freedom, joy, and grace. It's a journey worth taking. Last week, we began this series looking at the concept of original sin. In our world, talking about sin at all can seem politically incorrect. Sin has come to be associated with judgmentalism, bigotry, and hypocrisy. In various eras of the church's history, there's been a magnified emphasis on sin, which has led many people to reduce Catholicism to rule-keeping and sin avoidance. It's led to a lot of Catholic guilt. The solution to this historical overemphasis on sin, I think, is not to underemphasize sin. It's not to ignore it or deny it. No, it's to really dig in to understand it. Original sin stems from the temptation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to be like gods. It's a tendency which curves us inward. Original sin doesn't mean that you're innately bad. In fact, the Bible tells us humans are innately good. Original sin refers to humanity's innate predisposition to curve inward. What does it mean to curve inward? Well, it's all about living a life inward for yourself instead of outward for God and others. It's our tendency to choose to serve ourselves first instead of choosing to serve God or others first. Curving inward leads us to grasp for control, to believe our way is the only way. Curving inward is seen in our tendency to hide from God, to recite prayers or go through the motions, but to resist truly opening our hearts and our lives to God. Curving inward is our tendency to focus on my needs and my preferences instead of what's best for the communities that I'm part of. When we understand our human predisposition to curve inward, we accept that failing and falling short is part of life. And this understanding can free us from guilt and shame and open us up to the good news and grace of a relationship with the loving, living God. So this week, I want to explore the dynamic of guilt and shame more specifically. I think it's important to start with trying to unravel the difference between these two ideas. Guilt is generally action-based. It's when we recognize that we did something wrong. Guilt says, I did something bad. But shame is different. Shame says not just, I did something bad, but I am bad. While guilt is action-based, shame is identity-based. Shame internalizes the action. And in that sense, shame is a powerful and dangerous trap. Here's one simple definition of shame. Shame is the deep sense that you are unacceptable because of something you did, something done to you, or something associated with you. It's important to clarify that sometimes shame has nothing to do with what we've done, but rather with something we've experienced, abuse, or an illness, or a set of circumstances that we were born into. It's so important to look at this topic because no matter the source of your shame, it can be so damaging and wreak so much havoc in our lives. We can learn a lot about this dynamic by digging into today's gospel, and specifically by focusing on the experience of Peter. Today's gospel centers around this incredible experience where Jesus is transformed in appearance, called the Transfiguration. Just before this story of the Transfiguration, Peter had just made this astounding declaration that Jesus was not merely a prophet or a wise teacher, but in fact, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus praised him in response. And then Jesus begins to explain to Peter and the other disciples that while he is the Messiah, he is also going to suffer and be killed. Well, at this, Peter jumps in to correct Jesus, saying, "God forbid, Lord, no such thing shall ever happen to you." In response, Jesus rebukes Peter sharply, saying, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle to me. You're thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." Now, I mention this whole backstory because I think it's really critical to what's going on in today's gospel. Now, it must have felt pretty terrible to Peter to receive such a seemingly harsh rebuke from Jesus. Did he feel guilt? Shame? Maybe. Probably. It would have felt humiliating to have been so wrong and in front of all the other disciples. So this is the baggage that Peter brings into today's gospel story. And here's what happens. Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. So Jesus takes just these 3 disciples up a mountain with him. And then he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with him. And this is no ordinary experience. Something incredible happens. Jesus is transformed. It's hard to imagine what this would have been like. Jesus was fully human and fully divine. But in this moment, his divine glory breaks through. And he's talking with 2 heroes of the Jewish tradition, Moses and Elijah. So that's what's happening when all of a sudden Peter jumps in. He says to Jesus, "Lord, it's good that we're here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter jumps in because maybe, just maybe, he's trying to prove himself. Maybe that experience of being rebuked is motivating him. That voice of shame is whispering, "You messed up before, so you better make it look like you know what you're doing now. You better prove yourself and get it right this time." The thing about shame is that it always leads us to actions and responses that are not positive or helpful. Our actions and our responses are an attempt to get rid of shame, because shame is painful. It can feel utterly intolerable. There are many ways to respond to the pain of shame. But there seem to be four main ways that we respond to shame. First, we withdraw. We believe that lie that we're inherently flawed, and we hide from God and from others. This is what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden. Second, we attack others. We lash out and we blame other people for our problems. And we focus on how bad they are to relieve feelings of how bad we fear we are. Third, we attack ourselves. We view our shame as valid and we turn our anger inward. We make a case against ourselves, piling up all the things that we've done wrong. And fourth, we avoid. This is the path that Peter takes. He deflects attention elsewhere. Oh, I might be bad at that, but I'm really good at this. We try to cover our shame with a perfect performance or a right answer. We try to cover up for how bad we feel by proving that, well, actually, we're the best, we're perfect, or at least we've got a good idea. Now, I share these examples because I think it's so important for us to recognize these responses that can become patterns in our lives. These are traps that we fall into over and over again. Sometimes we get stuck there without even realizing it, and it just makes us more stuck. These actions don't make shame go away. They actually make shame worse. You can't run away from shame. You can't think your way out of shame, or attack your way out of shame, or deny your way out of shame, or blame your way out of shame. So, we know what unhealthy responses to shame look like. But what does a healthy response look like? Well, shame is a cycle that needs to be interrupted. And I love how that's literally what God does with Peter. Look what happens. While Peter was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud cast a shadow over them. And then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." God gives Peter and us a simple, healthy step forward. Instead of listening to shame, listen to him. Listen for God's voice in your life, particularly when it comes to who you are. The thing is, shame always has to do with who and what we're listening to. Shame is born when we listen to our own voice of fear and self-criticism, or we listen to the real or perceived voices of others. We only begin to heal from our shame by listening to God's voice, listening to God's truth about our worth and value. So that's my challenge for you this week. In the midst of shame, stop listening to your own voice or the accusing voices of others and start listening to God's voice. How? Well, listen for God's voice by reading the scriptures. Download the Bible app and look up your favorite Bible story or the daily or Sunday gospel. And as you read, ask yourself this question: what does this story tell me about who God is and who I am? We can also listen for God's voice by making room for conversation with others. God speaks so powerfully through relationships. What is God saying through your spouse or your child or your coworker? You know, some people in our community who are trying out a small group during Lent are making room to listen. And I hope they'll experience God's voice in a profound way. We listen for God's voice by being still and silent in God's presence. It's a simple prayer. God, show me my heart and show me the truth about myself. Maybe you can be still and silent in the car instead of turning on the radio. Maybe it's the first thing before you start your day or the last thing you do before you go to sleep. To be clear, this is not a quick fix solution for shame. There isn't a quick fix solution for shame. The only solution for shame is to enter into a process of healing, a process of being transformed, which takes time. But we can enter into this process knowing that this is exactly where God wants to meet us. After God tells Peter to listen to his son, look what happens. When the disciples heard this, they fell prostrate and were very much afraid. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Rise and do not be afraid." Jesus doesn't say, "Thanks for ruining the moment, Peter. Great job." He comes over and he touches him. He embraces him. He gives him an experience of his closeness and love and compassion. And Jesus says, "Rise," a word that's connected to his resurrection and the new life that we can experience in Jesus. It's the same word he used when he healed a sick girl. Rise, be healed. Do not be afraid. Stop listening to shame. Listen instead to God's voice. Shame makes us run and hide. But Jesus says, with his help, we can face this. We can heal from this. Rise and do not be afraid.